It's Thanksgiving Day in the USA, so I'm thankful to Leslie Cox and Lauren Jacobs of the Cape Town Historical Foundation for inviting me to give this talk. None of my work on Lady Anne Lindsay's art would be possible without the permission of the 29th Earl of Crawford and Balcarres and the Balcarres Heritage Trust, and I thank them for their ongoing support. Over the last few years, Esther Esmiol, the curator of the Social History Collection and the William Furr Collection, has been an invaluable research resource for me and an advocate of my work. And I'm so grateful to her and to Fatima February and to Leila Hisham for giving me such unfettered access to Lady Anne's art in these archives and for arranging this talk in these lovely resonant rooms. So everyone here today has heard of Lady Anne Lindsay Barnard, a romantic and well-known figure in the social history of the Cape of Good Hope. Everyone knows that Lady Anne came to the Cape in 1797 as the spouse of Andrew Barnard, secretary to Lord George Macartney, the first British governor of the British administration that presided between 1795 and the Peace of Amiens in 1802. We know that the Barnards lived here at the castle in these very rooms, and then at Paradise Cottage in Upper Rondebosch, and then at the Vineyard, the country house that they built in 1799 and 1800 in the New Lands. We know that Lady Anne threw great parties here in these rooms, especially during Macartney's short tenure, when she was a favorite, and less so after Sir George Young became governor. We know that she climbed Table Mountain, and the Barnards took a reconnaissance trip through the Western Cape in 1798, staying with several of the great Dutch families, such as the Van Rienens. And while Andrew talked business with the proprietors of those estates, Lady Anne engaged with the womenfolk, the children and servants, and took sketches of landscapes and people almost as readily as we today would snap pictures with our cell phones. Because Lady Anne's Cape journals and letters are all so abundantly engaged in local description, detail, personalities, and gossip, it's easy for us to think that we know what she thinks and that we have taken the measure of her mind. Certainly, every possible topic of interest seems to be covered in her writings from the Cape, including romance, sex, marriage, cooking, domesticity, parties, animals, domesticated and wild, insects, gardening, architecture, trade, public policy, theatre, writing, economics, natural science, town planning, landscape drawing, political intrigue, local and international, crime and punishment, death, law, political insurrection, the French wars, the Indian mutinies, slavery, race relations, miscegenation, and cultural differences in general. It's an astonishing range of interests for someone who apparently lives a very, very private life. But how seriously have we taken her views on any of these topics? Margaret Lenter, Dorothy Driver, and Jessica Murray have discussed strategies used by Lady Anne to maneuver herself as a writer within the traditional patriarchal world that she occupied. But since her status as a woman accorded no official remit nor authority to express herself on any political or historical topic, it is no wonder that very little serious, sustained attention has been given to her views. Nor is it surprising that her drawings and watercolors have been seen largely as amateur indulgences, at best as illustrations to the diaries of everyday life that she was keeping, and merely expressive of commonplace and privileged views. Lady Anne's art remains obscure for several reasons. One has to do with their inaccessibility. Most of her watercolors exist in a private archive in Scotland, strictly controlled by the Earl of Crawford and Balcarres. None of these paintings at Balcarres has, as far as I know, ever been exhibited. Yes, in 2009, Nicholas Barker published reproductions of the Cape paintings in a very nice color edition by Fernwood Press. There's a copy down the end of the table there. In a private limited run edition, which is now out of print. Cape archives, such as this wonderful museum, possess some of Lady Anne's drawings and artworks in general, and these are more readily accessible. But none of her artworks has been seriously considered by art historians. That Lady Anne might be considered as an artist in her own right, with her own distinctive vision, making her own independent contribution to the artistic apprehension of life, seems not to have occurred to anyone, including Nicholas Barker, the editor of that book. I quite understand the obstacles. She has, for so long, been taken to be an intellectual lightweight, whose social and personal musings and hyper-realist art are so like the everyday that it is difficult to see why we should bother with them as paintings. They look like life. Furthermore, her depictions of indigenous peoples have been swept up and swept away in the critique of colonial culture that has provided many reasons for dismissing the work of a European in a colonial setting. Many justified, of course. By referring to an unknown Lady Anne Lindsay, I do not mean to suggest that she had a radical hidden agenda. Like others in the British cohort at the Cape in the 1790s, she saw national security as primary. They were fighting a war with France and needed to be here. And she believed in the social, political, and legal institutions that they brought with them. She was a team player. But this normativity too easily overshadows the intellectual independence and free thinking that was fostered by the rugged country Scottish upbringing in Fife and the immersion in the ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment that formed her character. In what follows, I should like to look at a very small slice of Lady Anne's artistic engagement with life at the Cape, some drawings she took in Swellendam in May 1798, as a way of drawing critical attention to her paintings, which I suggest reveal complexities and depths of her response to the people that she met. Lady Anne's journal indicates that between May the 18th and the 23rd, 1798, she and her husband were hosted by Anthony Faure, or Foree, the Landrost of Swellendam, and by Jacobus Conradi, one of the settler farmers there. She meets a variety of people in the area, both from the Dutch families and from the servants and enslaved people working on the estates. And she records taking drawings of the Drosti and the village and of several people. On the 18th, for example, she paints, as she writes, I quote, a couple of African slave girls, sisters, who were unaware of what she was doing. Also, she draws what she describes as, I quote, the horse godmother, by whom I think she means the wife of the Landrost, Caterina Cornelia, who sat with her back to Lady Anne with, and I quote, such a profusion of mane about her that I made her sit still and drew it, unquote. At Caterina's request, Lady Anne draws her daughter, presumably Petronia Sophia, born 1787, so 11 years of age, but unsatisfactorily because Petronia also would not sit still. Then, at his own request, Lady Anne drew the preacher Johann Heinrich von Munger from behind, in his greatcoat, sermon in hand. We do not, as far as I know, have a picture of Caterina, but here are the pictures of the others mentioned so far, just so that you have an idea of what we are talking about. Two slave girls, the Landrost's daughter, that looks like two people, but I believe it's a study of the same person taken from slightly different points of view. And of course, Mr. Munger. So none of these people were particularly pleased with what Lady Anne had done because as she says, I quote, people don't choose to be done as they are, but as they would be. They have an ideal image of themselves. So, moving on the 19th, Lady Anne returns to the drawing of the Lundros daughter. But Katerina does not like this either, because Lady Anne does not paint the girl's face. But perhaps she doesn't like it also because Lady Anne seems to be more interested in what she describes as, I quote, a pretty copper-colored slave working away on the ground. In the slow, indolent way the slaves work here, gently pulling out her thread as if she could no much care whether it came out or no, and throwing me a timid, conscious look from a pair of fine black eyes. And this, I believe, is the so-called Maid of Madagascar. But then on the 21st, Lady Anne draws a sand woman with her baby, describing the baby in her journal as like an Indian god, I quote, and describing the mother's countenance as, I quote, sweet to a degree, extremely like Lady Abercorn's, unquote. The Scot John Hamilton, Marquis of Abercorn, was an Irish politician peer, and Lady Abercorn is the wife to which Lady Anne is comparing this lady here. But it's unclear which of the Marquis's 3 wives Lady Anne had in mind. Probably Lady Cecil Hamilton, because the dates seem to align. But the bossy woman's sweetness, this lady's sweetness, brings Lady Abercorn to Lady Anne's mind. Then also on the 21st, she draws a little coy girl, as she says, belonging to the Conradis, whom she describes as not arrived at woman's estate. I'd like to concentrate on this picture for a few minutes. This coy girl with a monkey, and we'll revise the use of the word monkey in a minute, and the painting of the 2 younger enslaved girls mentioned already. These 3 girls apparently are different people. None of them is named by Lady Anne, but they also are, in a sense, the same girl. For these pictures seem to me to be artistic studies on a common theme. And they also seem to me to be Lady Anne's way of exploring ways of looking and feeling about what she encounters. More detail about this in a moment, but let's note first that Lady Anne drew each of these girls as she encountered them in the moment. They didn't pose, and that she later transformed her drawings into watercolors at home or in a studio somewhere. One point to make about all of these finished pictures is that they partake of common qualities. For example, they're almost all rendered without environmental context. Certainly, she does occasionally use dogs and chairs as aide-de-memoire, and sometimes she includes the barest abstract hillside or landscape as a backdrop, as she does here. And into these empty spaces, she drops her subjects fully formed. This is a very deceptive practice, because it's easy to assume that because the subjects appear to be finished and real, they're so clear, full, obvious, and objective, that what we have in front of us is a simple documentary record, something she saw with her own eyes and nothing more. But in fact, the hyperreal object-like qualities of these paintings are the result of the eye reflected in the inner eye and transformed by artistic form and color. These people didn't exist. They're in her imagination. A second general point to make is this. Post-colonial historiography teaches us that while a white colonial woman in Africa could necessarily only paint an exotic fantasy, something that incorporated an existing racist economic power structure, rather than what was actually there. Well, there's no question that Lady Anne exists within such structures of perception, and that she's probably not painting what was really there. Well, what then is she painting? What are these? I'd like to suggest that in these paintings, her subject is the subjectivity of her subjects. Of the little girl, for example. This does not mean that in the case of the little girl with the monkey, her painting comprehends or exhausts the girl's subjectivity. Indeed, the girl's subjectivity is to some extent inaccessible to Lady Anne. And that inaccessibility is, to a large extent, what she paints. She's interested in not knowing the girl in front of her. If the girl is a mystery to Lady Anne, it is one to which she feels herself strongly attracted. Where do I see all of this? Well, for a start, I read the works as paintings and not as documentary evidence. I see in it the texture of the clothing and the bodies, and I see it in the intense use of color. These qualities are not peculiar to these pictures of these little girls, because they also characterize the pictures of Petronia Sophia, Mr. Munger, the seamstress, and many others. But in the pictures of the girls, these qualities operate as a filter, a mode of seeing them. The rich texture of the white cotton dress, simple as it may be, the stylish tinge of gray in the thick, healthy, curly hair of the girl with the monkey. What a great hairstyle that is. In fact, when I showed my wife that picture, she said that she was going to take a picture of that hairstyle to the hairdresser the next time she went. I see it also in the deep, warm brown of the skin, the beauty of the faces, the intensity of the colors in general, all set off against the pale wash of the sky and the light blue and ruddy brown shades of the landscape. These are all technologies of seeing. I'm struck that Lady Anne clearly does not see any contradiction between the beauty of the face in the picture on the left and the bare feet and the rugged arms, which suggest social and economic subservience and servitude. Though the girl is a servant, she describes her as a slave girl, though the girl she's beautiful to Lady Anne. All these features, I suggest, contribute to the substantiality, the immediate presence of these girls' bodies and being, and a sense of their existential independence from Lady Anne's perception, even though, obviously, these images exist on the page as the product of Lady Anne's art. So they're both phenomenologically objective and existent, and yet they are also figments of her imagination. Why? Because she's a very fine artist and is able to create an objective correlative of the image that is in the mind. But let me dwell on this paradox for a minute. On the one hand, the images are simple, homemade, awkward, material, even a little amateurish. At the same time, the composition, the form and color of these paintings come together to make something dynamic, delightful, and a little mysterious or risque. What mood, let's go back here for a minute, what mood and spirit do the facial expressions of these girls convey? Well, what would you say to coyness on the left, doubt, and melancholy? These are all intellectual and spiritual qualities, coyness, doubt, and melancholy. Perhaps Anne's version of the growing number of philosopher paintings that were available to Europeans by the end of the 18th century. These are not blank existences. These are spiritual existences. This is where we need to note that the girl with the monkey is clearly depicted more dynamically than the others. She's older, has more personality. We know too that Lady Anne has given this older girl more European features. She's made her up as well, in the sense of having cosmeticized her to have a different kind of beauty. And she's made her up in the sense of inventing her as well. So others have noticed that Lady Anne's European or white subjects are usually portrayed in profile or from behind. And we saw Mr. Manga and the others just a moment ago suggesting, among other things, that she is observing 18th century moral protocols whereby women did not usually gaze directly at the artist. Their views are almost always slightly averted from the direct gaze of the artist. Such protocols, however, do not apply to Anne's depiction of this girl, this coy girl, who provides Anne with an opportunity, I think, to tap into feelings and a vision usually forbidden to her. This enables her, I think, this freedom enables her to indulge in a real stroke of artistic genius, the introduction of the monkey and the rich pink scarf, which are poetically, fluidly, contrapuntally interwoven with each other and with the slight curves of the girl's body. So my first response on seeing this painting years ago was to worry, because I thought that Anne was being disrespectful and indulging in an Enlightenment stereotype by sexualizing the girl and associating her race with nature, with something primitive. Though the painting may perhaps have a little bit of that, my sense now, after having read tens of thousands of her words, no, probably hundreds of thousands of her words, and looked at almost every one of her pictures that I could find, is of the sheer delight expressed in and by the pictures, this picture in particular, beautiful and faintly shocking as it may be. If the girl is a mystery to Lady Anne, she also clearly exudes a sense of their human commonalities. Well, let me try to say a little bit more about what I mean by that. So on May the 20th, 1798, in Swellendam, Lady Anne records in her diary that a rather innocuous episode. The Barnards had hoped to go off to Graafrenet from Swellendam, but were persuaded to change their mind because of the uprising in Graafrenet. Lady Anne had imagined that Graafrenet would have given her access to a different Africa, which she describes as follows, and I quote, her prose is sometimes very tenuous, and she has never heard of commas or semicolons, or indeed of capitalization. So you have to listen very carefully for the sense of the several quotations that I'm going to read in the next few minutes. So she describes this imagined visit to Graafrenet, those parts of Africa where nature becomes wilder and where there is less affinity in it to what has been seen before. Animals more singular and numerous, plants totally different, and where even the animal man seems to break his link almost asunder into a variety of distinct classes nowhere more markedly various, I have heard, in this very quarter of the globe, unquote. Now, if Lady Anne is channeling Rousseau's idea of the noble savage here, and if this quotation suggests a fantasization of Africa as a mythic, exotic, and innocent world, we might notice that she distinguishes herself. We might notice that she distinguishes herself along with, in the same category with, I quote, the Hottentots, Caffres, and bossy men She's not in a separate category from them. She's in the same category as them, and she distinguishes that category from the, quote, nations on nations to be found in the interior, unquote. However, we then learn from the same passage in the diary that she thinks these nations are not actually savage. She says that she had, I quote, great hopes that it was on the coast of Africa that there existed a people who were mentioned to me lately as having shown much humanity and kindness to Captain Broughton and his crew, who commanded a small ship sent on a voyage of discovery, since lost. Okay, unquote. Well, Captain Broughton, I don't know who he is, but Captain Broughton apparently described these people to Lady Anne as being, I quote, a mild race of people of gentle and hospitable manners, but entirely overgrown with hair. No tails, however. They wear clothes and hose on the ladies, not ungracefully put on, unquote. So, this is very strange. Lady Anne's reference here to tails may seem a bit bizarre, except that tails are strategic to her meditation on her African dream nation and on how it helps her to think about the human family to which they and she belong. So she completes these particular remarks as follows, and here we have to pay careful attention. So I quote, "These people, I should think, were likely to come in for a good place in hunters' gradations, from the human race downwards, where I have heard, say, a step or two was wanting in the great staircase of descent, there being a chasm between Negro and orangutan, which my hairy friends, I dare say, supply," unquote. Now, hunters' gradations refer to the work of the distinguished surgeon and anatomist Dr. John Hunter, whose writings proposed, or whose work on fossils, proposed degrees of evolution between human and animal nature as a way of identifying the antiquity of the human race. In her understanding, Lady Anne points out the distance between these two, that is, between the human race, in which she includes herself, and the so-called, and she quotes, Negro, and the orangutan, between which two categories there is a chasm, apparently inhabited by Captain Broughton's hairy inhabitants. It's an extraordinary vision of human descent, but there it is. Now, Lady Anne's mentioning the orangutan is also not random, because she would have been familiar with the anthropological work of James Burnet, Lord Monboddo, Scottish judge and philosopher, friend of her uncle's, the scientist and medical doctor Sir Alexander Dick. Monboddo was living and working in Edinburgh in the 1770s when Lady Anne was frequenting her uncle's home at Prestonfield. Monboddo's Of the Origin and Progress of Language, published in 6 volumes between 1773 and 1798, was a proto-Darwinian attempt to trace the evolutionary origins of the human race to the orangutan, an idea that many at the time found ludicrous. Samuel Johnson made a lot of fun of Monboddo, and the word tails was always involved in the fun that Johnson made of Monboddo. But the fact is that Monboddo was right, and Johnson was actually wrong. Am I dreaming then when I imagine Lady Anne's thinking of Monboddo's orangutan when she attempts to humanize this girl by rendering her with a monkey? Or is it a baboon on her shoulder? Presumably the girl did not actually have a baboon on her shoulder. There's no mention of one in Lady Anne's diary entry. And it's probably an artistic invention, although my friends tell me that tame baboons exist and are to be found, and that it's entirely possible that there was one. But Lady Anne doesn't mention a baboon in the diary entry, but she puts one into the picture, and I think it makes the picture extraordinary. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Lady Anne had sympathetic feelings for baboons, the baboons that she encountered here, unlike other European travelers at the Cape, such as Sparman or Thunberg, who tended to observe, measure, categorize, and to kill them. When Andrew Barnard shoots a baboon in 1799, he was always shooting things. She drew things, he shot them. When Andrew Barnard shoots a baboon in 1799 that had been wreaking havoc in their garden, Lady Anne, I quote, was sorry for the poor animal, half man in appearance, unquote. In another incident in the same year, she was amused at a large baboon picking the fleas off her dog, because, she says, it is quite a picture of human nature in burlesque to see a monkey so employed. And she jokes at that time that she would like to offer the baboon the job of catching her fleas, about which she's always complaining. Every second page she's complaining about her fleas. She clearly sees something of herself in the baboon, absurd as that might sound. And if Monboddo's theory, if in Monboddo's theory, the Scottish literati can see themselves as biologically intertwined with the orangutan, why cannot the baboon, which is an artistic metaphor and a genetic link, link Lady Anne to this coy girl? Of course, much depends on how you understand the relation between the baboon and the girl in this picture, where one might see degrading insensitivity on Lady Anne's part. It's also possible to see an amused gentleness and kindness, as well as a vibrant energy in the picture that brings the girl closer to Lady Anne. I think she loves this child. There's a bit more. In her journal for the 21st of May, 1798, Lady Anne notes, and I quote, "I drew one little girl, this one, not arrived at woman's estate, who had a sweet countenance, and who I should have liked to have taken with me, but who would have been too dear to purchase, being the property of the farmer," unquote. Well, at first sight, I freaked out when I read that, because it looked like a racist, unfeeling statement. But we might remember that purchasing the girl from Conradi, however morally compromised that may have been and how repugnant it is to us, would have been the only way, under the economic organization of the Cape at the time, of enfranchising the girl. There was no other way. Indeed, in the same paragraph, Lady Anne expresses the view that even under present economic circumstances, the girl ought to be freed at the age of 13 or 14. And she says further, I quote, "I have some reason to hope the governor, Macartney, will shorten the term of slavery to those poor, oppressed creatures. I'm sure he will if he thinks it just," unquote. Lamentably, we know that even Macartney, who was gone by the end of 1798, was unable to make any meaningful change to the slave culture at the Cape, though he did put a stop to trading slaves. There was no trading of slaves, no slave ships in the harbor during his tenure, until his successor, Sir George Young, reinstated the practice, because he was on the take, right? And he was a Boer. I mean, in the sense of Boerish, not a farmer. Still, there was something that Lady Anne could do to make a difference here, and that was to paint the girl, even though obviously painting her could not enfranchise her from her material bonds. She was clearly stimulated by this encounter, as we can see from her earlier drafts of the painting. The image we've been talking about here is the finished watercolor at Balcarres. But Esther Esmiel and Fatima February have recently shown me this version, an earlier version of the painting in the archive. This is probably one of several stages between the drawing that Lady Anne would have taken in the moment at Swellendam and the watercolor that she would have worked on and completed in her studio. In this wonderful iteration, both body and clothing are still like holograms, with no color nor depth, and none of the warm substance or fluidity they were to acquire in the colorized version. This, what we have here, these two versions, this is a dramatic exemplification of how Lady Anne imparts life to a subject by the application of paint. But crucially, the expression on this girl's face is quite different. This is more one of surprise and apprehension rather than the coy seductiveness of the finished version. Indeed, this girl is more like one of the other younger enslaved girls. Let's see if I have them. No, I don't have them. As if Lady Anne had changed her mind in the process of making this picture. She started with one of the other faces, this face, and in the course of producing the watercolor, she's changed her mind. It seems also that it is only as she transforms the girl's face from innocence to experience that she introduces the fabulous pink scarf. This one doesn't have the pink scarf. That interweaves the girl with life and nature and with Lady Anne herself. It's as if the scarf is Lady Anne's version of Hogarth's line of beauty, or it's as if the scarf is Lady Anne's version of Monboddo's orangutan, the tale of the orangutan. Well, apart from Katerina and her daughter, who posed, all of Lady Anne's subjects in Swellendam were simply going about their business. And I think she preferred drawing people like that, even though she was irritated by their movements sometimes. The watercolors that we see on the screen here would have been the result of later, further stages of work in the studio. We have very little information about Lady Anne's artistic process. Did she use a portable paint box that she brought with her from England? Did she mix her paints? These would have contained little cakes of watercolor paint. Did she mix these with local materials, with water obviously, with gums, with plant matter? Somehow she found a way of producing extraordinary color, an extraordinary color palette that I haven't seen in any other painter in the 18th century, however amateurish the paintings might be. In the case of the coy girl with the baboon, and perhaps also in one or two other cases, but certainly in this case, we have two different iterations of the same painting that lifts the curtain just a little on her process and gives us an idea of how deliberate and intentional she was as an artist. This was not someone that just dashed off a drawing because she happened to be bored. She may have been an amateur, but her artistic consciousness was highly developed. There's one final point I want to make before I end, and this adds further nuance to her depiction of the girl with the baboon. Among the images that might have been present to her mind in exploring her feelings of consanguinity with this girl is the now famous 1778 painting by Scottish painter David Martin of Dido Elizabeth Bell with her cousin Lady Elizabeth Murray. Excuse me, there she is. Well, Dido Bell, on the left, is pictured here with her cousin in the grounds of Kenwood House, Hampstead, the home of Lady Anne's uncle, another uncle, William Murray, Earl of Mansfield. Mansfield was the Lord Chief Justice who in 1772 ruled against slave trading in Britain, in Somerset's case, a landmark ruling that effectively said no person could be enslaved in Britain. Okay. And Dido was Lady Anne's second cousin, the daughter of her cousin, Captain Sir John Lindsay, and Maria Bell, an enfranchised Jamaican. So when Lady Anne gives the coy girl this gesture, could she be alluding to Dido's gesture as a way of tapping into the same set of feelings that she had towards her mixed race cousin Dido, whom she would have known at Kenwood House? Whatever the answer to this and other questions of this kind, I hope you'll agree that they point to aspects of Lady Anne's mind and artistic experience that has too long remained unknown. Thank you.